Hey folks, Mr. Howard here. I'm going to do chapter 15 of The Picture of Dorian Gray. We read chapter 14 last week, in which Dorian blackmailed a guy named Alan Campbell, who probably represented science, to use his scientific knowledge of chemistry to disintegrate Basil's murdered body. So he used science to cover up the death of God, metaphorically. There were lots of things to think about in that chapter, and I sort of left you with some questions. Hopefully you've thought about them and considered them. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have thoughts or ideas or questions that I can answer. But we're just going to open up into chapter 15 now, which immediately follows that. So remember, not a lot of time has passed since the murder of Basil. The murder of Basil was on the eve of Dorian Gray's 38th birthday, so then he spends his 38th birthday blackmailing Alan to destroy the body, and then chapter 15 is the evening, so it's still his birthday. It's that evening. So here we go. That evening at 8:30, exquisitely dressed and wearing a large buttonhole of Parma violets, Dorian Gray was ushered into Lady Narborough's drawing room by bowing servants. His forehead was throbbing with maddened nerves, and he felt wildly excited, but his manner as he bent over his hostess's hand was easy and graceful as ever. Perhaps one never seems so much at one's ease as one has a part to play. So Dorian seems particularly at his ease, even though he murdered Basil last night and covered it up. I think it's interesting that he has a part to play. Not only now is he a spectator of his own life, but he's a player in it, and he's leading a second double existence or something like that. That was a very big thing in Victorian literature too. Like trying to lead a double life. You watch or you read Jekyll and Hyde. Clearly this is going on here. If you read another one of Oscar Wilde's plays, The Importance of Being Earnest, having a double life shows up in there. There is a ton of Victorian stories in which double lives take place. Anyway, back to it. Certainly no one looked at Dorian Gray that night. Who looked at Dorian Gray that night could have believed that he had passed through a tragedy as horrible as any tragedy of our age. Those finely shaped fingers could never have clutched a knife for sin, nor those smiling lips have cried out on God and goodness. He himself could not help wondering at the calm of his demeanor, and for a moment he felt keenly the terrible pleasure of a double life. It was a small party, got up rather in a hurry by Lady Narborough, who was a very clever woman with what Lord Henry used to describe as the remains of a really remarkable ugliness. Pause again. This sets her up as a contrast to Dorian Gray. He's got remarkable beauty. This woman has, quote, the remains of a really remarkable ugliness. I love that line. In order for something to be remarkable, people would have to remark on it. Like, you're in the grocery store and you see this woman walking up and down the aisles. You'd wait until she's out of earshot, and then you'd turn to your friend and be like, wow, did you see how ugly she was? She's ugly enough that people would talk about it. But she isn't anymore because she has the remains of it. So I think that this connects also to the idea of youth, which has been a consistent theme or idea in the story. When you're old, you're no longer ugly or beautiful. You're just old. So Lady Narborough no longer has that ugliness. It's passed into age. So I guess if you're really ugly, congratulations. When you get older, you're just old. You're not ugly anymore. Where was I? She had proved an excellent wife to one of our most tedious ambassadors, and having buried her husband properly in a marble mausoleum, which she had herself designed, and married off her daughters to some rich, rather elderly men, she devoted herself now to the pleasures of French fiction, French cookery, and French spirit, whenever she could get it. Dorian was one of her special favorites, and she always told him she was extremely glad she had not met him early in life. "I know, my dear, I should have fallen madly in love with you," she used to say, "and thrown my bonnet right over the mills for your sake. It is most fortunate that you were not thought of at the time. As it was, our bonnets were so unbecoming, and the mills were so occupied in trying to raise the wind, that I never had even a flirtation with anybody. However, that was all Narborough's fault. He was dreadfully short-sighted, and there is no pleasure in taking a husband who never sees anything." That almost feels like a paradox, this idea that she never cheated on her husband because he wouldn't have noticed. The only reason to cheat on him is to make him jealous. It says something about British culture, or Oscar Wilde's impression of British culture, especially the upper class. They only do these negative things to be noticed. It's like they want the notoriety or the scandal on some level to add interest to their lives. Her guests this evening were rather tedious. The fact was, as she explained to Dorian behind a very shabby fan, one of her married daughters had come up quite suddenly to stay with her, and to make matters worse, had actually brought her husband with her. "I think it's most unkind of her, my dear," she whispered. "Of course, I go and stay with them every summer after I come back from Hamburg. But then an old lady like me must have some fresh air sometimes. And besides, I really wake them up. You don't know what an existence they lead down there. It is pure, unadulterated country life. They get up early because they have so much to do, and they go to bed early because they have so little to think about. There has not been a scandal in the neighborhood since the time of Queen Elizabeth, and consequently, they fall asleep after dinner. You shan't sit next to either of them. You shall sit next to me and amuse me." Dorian murmured a graceful compliment and looked round the room. Yes, it was certainly a tedious party. Two of the people he had never seen before, and the others consisted of Ernest Harrowden, one of those middle-aged mediocrities so common in London clubs, who have no enemies, but are thoroughly disliked by their friends; Lady Ruxton, an overdressed woman of 47, with a hooked nose, who was always trying to get herself compromised, but was so peculiarly plain that to her great disappointment no one would ever believe anything against her; Mrs. Yuri Lynn, a pushing nobody with a delightful lisp and Venetian red hair; Lady Alice Chapman, his hostess's daughter, a dowdy, dull girl with one of those characteristic British faces that once seen are never remembered; and her husband, a red-cheeked, white-whiskered creature who, like so many of his class, was under the impression that inordinate joviality can atone for an entire lack of ideas. This whole section is clearly social commentary on London society. It throws a bunch of stereotypes in there and picks fun at them. I mean, it's really kind of funny. I mean, especially when you look at this woman, Lady Ruxton, who's always trying to get into an affair, but nobody will have an affair with her because she's too ugly, and then nobody will believe that she's ever done anything bad because of how she looks. That's like a contrast to Dorian. Nobody believes that he's done anything bad because he looks so beautiful and innocent, but nobody believes that she's done anything bad because she's too ugly to have done anything bad. Which, you know, they have the same outcome, but they're opposite effects. I think that's interesting. He was rather sorry he had come, till Lady Narborough, looking at the great ormulu gilt clock that sprawled in gaudy curves on the mauve-draped mantel-shelf, she exclaimed, "How horrid of Lord Henry wanting to be so late! I sent round to him this morning on chance, and he promised faithfully not to disappoint me." It was some consolation that Harry was to be there, and when the door opened and he heard his slow musical voice lending charm to some insincere apology, he ceased to feel bored. But at dinner he could not eat anything. Plate after plate went away untasted. Lady Narborough kept scolding him for what she called an insult to poor Adolf, who invented the menu specially for you. It's kind of fun that this book predates Hitler, so you can use the word Adolf and not, like cringe, I guess. That name's been ruined forever. And now and then Lord Henry looked across at him, wondering at his silence and abstracted manner. From time to time the butler filled his glass with champagne. He drank eagerly, and his thirst seemed to increase. So two things here. Number one, Dorian's not acting like himself, so maybe he does have some conscience. Maybe he is feeling bad or upset about Basil's murder. He hasn't been able to purge that from himself or view it as a spectator. Second, he's not eating anything, and it says here that he keeps drinking. That's a recipe for being drunk, right? Like he's drinking too much. "Dorian," said Lord Henry at last, as the chafroid was being handed round, "what is the matter with you tonight? You are quite out of sorts." "I believe he's in love," cried Lady Narborough, "and that he is afraid to tell me for fear I should be jealous. He is quite right." "I certainly should." "Dear Lady Narborough," murmured Dorian, smiling, "I have not been in love for a whole week. Not, in fact, since Madame de Ferrel left town." "How you men can fall in love with that woman!" exclaimed the old lady. "I really cannot understand it." "It is simply because she remembered you when you were a little girl, Lady Narborough," said Lord Henry. "She is the one link between us and your short frocks." "She does not remember my short frocks at all, Lord Henry, but I remember her very well at Vienna 30 years ago, and how delicate she was then." It means promiscuous. She had a low-cut dress or whatever. "She is still delicate," he answered, taking an olive in his long fingers. And when she is in let me restart that. "And when she is in a very smart gown, she looks like an edition deluxe of a bad French novel." She is really wonderful and full of surprises. Her capacity for family affection is extraordinary. When her third husband died, her hair turned quite gold from grief. That's funny, but if you've read The Importance of Being Earnest, it's a recycled line. There's a couple of those in this chapter. It's like Oscar Wilde was rushing to get it done or something. How can you, Harry? Cried Dorian. It's a most romantic explanation, laughed the hostess. But her third husband, Lord Henry? You don't mean to say that Farrell is a fourth? Certainly, Lady Narborough. I don't believe a word of it. Well, ask Mr. Gray. He's one of our most intimate friends. Is it true, Mr. Gray? She assures me so, Lady Narborough, said Dorian. I asked her whether, like Margaret de Navarre, she had their hearts embalmed and hung at her girdle. She told me she didn't, because none of them had any hearts at all. 4 husbands, upon my word, that is too zealous. Too bold, I tell her, said Dorian. Oh, she's audacious enough for anything, my dear. And what is Farrell like? I don't know him. The husbands of very beautiful women belong in the criminal classes, said Lord Henry, sipping his wine. Lady Narborough hit him with her fan. Lord Henry, I am not at all surprised that the world says you are extremely wicked. Of course, here's some more like sort of tongue-in-cheek Satan references, right? This whole little section substantiates Lord Henry as Satan in our allegory that we've talked about a lot. But what world says that? Asked Lord Henry, elevating his eyebrows. It can only be the next world. This world and I are on excellent terms. Everybody I know says you're very wicked, cried the old lady, shaking her head. Lord Henry looked serious for some moments. It is perfectly monstrous, he said at last, the way people go about nowadays saying things against one behind one's back that are absolutely and entirely true. Isn't he incorrigible, cried Dorian, leaning forward in his chair. I hope so, said this hostess, laughing. But really, if you all worship Madame de Ferrol in this ridiculous way, I shall have to marry again so as to be in fashion. You will never marry again, Lady Narborough, broke in Lord Henry. You are far too happy. When a woman marries again, it is because she detested her first husband. When a man marries again, it is because he adored his first wife. Women try their luck. Men risk theirs. This is an aphorism. Stop and think about it. How Lord Henry's trying to dissect marriage in Victorian England. Narborough wasn't perfect, cried the old lady. If he had been, you would not have loved him, my dear lady, was the rejoinder. Women love us for our defects. If we have enough of them, they'll forgive us everything, even our intellects. You will never ask me to dinner again after saying this, I am afraid, Lady Narborough, but it is quite true. There's, again, Lord Henry has so many little tidbits of wisdom that if her husband was perfect, she wouldn't have loved him. It's almost impossible to love a perfect person. Imagine them always being right all the time. Ugh. So this idea that women love men because they're flawed and for their flaws, I think is a fascinating idea and worth consideration. Lady Narborough's response here, I think, is spot on, too. Of course it's true, Lord Henry. If we women did not love you for your defects, where would you all be? Not one of you would ever be married. You would be a set of unfortunate bachelors. Not, however, that would alter you much. Nowadays, all the married men live like bachelors, and all the bachelors like married men. Continued social commentary throughout. End of the century, murmured Lord Henry. End of the world, answered his hostess. I wish it were the end of the world, said Dorian with a sigh. Life is a great disappointment. Ah, my dear, cried Lady Narborough, putting on her gloves, don't tell me that you exhausted life. When a man says that, one knows life has exhausted him. Lord Henry is very wicked, and I sometimes wish that I had been, but you are made to be good. You look so good. I must find you a nice wife. Lord Henry, don't you think that Mr. Gray should be getting married? I am always telling him so, Lady Narborough, said Lord Henry with a bow. Well, we must look for a suitable match for him. I shall go through Derby carefully tonight and draw out a list of all the eligible young ladies. With their ages, Lady Narborough? Asked Dorian. Of course with their ages. It's slightly edited. But nothing must be done in a hurry. I want it to be what the Morning Post calls a suitable alliance. I want you both to be happy. What nonsense people talk about happy marriages, exclaimed Lord Henry. A man can be happy with any woman as long as he does not love her. Ah, what a cynic you are, cried the old lady, pushing back her chair and nodding to Lady Ruxton. You must come and dine with me soon again. You are really an admirable tonic, much better than what Sir Andrew prescribed.